So welcome everyone. On behalf of the Vertical Control Water Level Subcommittee, thank you for joining today. This virtual presentation will be entitled An Updated International Great Lakes Datum. What does this mean for your field of practice and your local community? It will seek to provide you with an overview of the ongoing update to the International Great Lakes Datum, known more commonly as IGLD 2020. Next slide. As Ed mentioned, I'm Nicole Kruz. I'm a Communications and Outreach Specialist with Linker. I'm currently contracted to NOAA Center for Operational Oceanographic Products and Services, which we like to call co-ops because we know that's a bit of a mouthful. I lead outreach for two large-scale datum updates. One is the International Great Lakes Datum, which we'll talk about today, and the other is the National Tidal Datum Epic, which is also currently undergoing a revision. Co-ops is the office within the National Ocean Service, so Bureau of NOAA. That's one of the U.S. federal agencies responsible for supporting the revision of the IGLD. I'm based at NOAA's main campus in Silver Spring, just outside of Washington, D.C. Next slide. So diving into the coordinating committee, the IGLD is managed by this committee. It's called the Coordinating Committee on Great Lakes Basic Hydraulic and Hydrologic Data. We like to refer to it as either the CC or the Coordinating Committee. The Coordinating Committee was formed in 1953. It's a binational ad hoc committee of federal scientists from several different US and Canadian federal agencies, including the Canadian Hydrographic Service, the Canadian Geodetic Survey, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the US Army Corps of Engineers, the US Geological Survey, and NOAA. These agencies are charged, These agencies are charged with the responsibility for collecting, compiling, and using and disseminating data related to hydraulics, hydrology, vertical control, and water levels for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River system. The Coordinating Committee serves in an advisory capacity and provides international standardization of hydrologic and hydraulic data for the federal agencies involved in monitoring and managing water levels. This presentation is brought to you by a subcommittee of the Coordinating Committee, and that's known as the Vertical Control Water Levels Subcommittee. Next slide. Today's talk will take you through the IGLD from start to finish. It will begin with a definition of the datum and providing some common applications of datums. We'll then move on to explain the attributes of the update, as well as the rationale behind the update, outlining the update's scope, expected impacts, and planned outreach. I've planned in some time at the end for questions. Next slide. So what is the IGLD? It's the vertical reference system used throughout the Great Lakes, their connecting channels, and the St. Lawrence River to measure water levels. It's acknowledged as the official datum in the region for water level measurements and navigation products. The framework is used by both the US and Canada. Its joint use ensures the internationally coordinated collection, compilation, use, and dissemination of data related to water level management, hydraulics, and hydrology. Next slide. Because water resources in the Great Lakes are jointly utilized between two countries, a common datum is necessary to measure water levels and relate them to one another in a meaningful way. So a fundamental requirement for this coordinated management is a common height reference system or vertical datum known as the IGLD. The IGLD and its water level gauging infrastructure support key transportation networks in the region to ensure reliable inland waterway networks. Next slide. Now that we've talked about what the IGLD is, let's dive into how water level datums are applied. So water level datums are used across a range of disciplines and sectors at the local, state, and national levels. They're used by both public and private entities to protect life and property, ensure safe navigation, and plan development in the coastal zone. I've listed some common users of water level datums here. They range from hydraulic engineers who use the datum to determine how deeply to dredge navigable channels and waterways. Lock and hydroelectric dam operators also monitor and regulate water levels referenced to a datum. Hydrographers reference datums when generating nautical charts, which are in turn used by mariners to navigate waterways. Ecologists also use datums to determine inundation from marsh restoration projects, and aquatic biologists use the datum to calculate dilution zones in marinas to determine safe habitat. And lastly, surveyors also map coastlines to the datum to determine marine boundaries. So the examples provided here are not exhaustive. NOAA expects, and the coordinating committee expects a range of regional operations and services to be impacted by the IGLD 2020 update. So over the next 4 years, we're going to conduct extensive outreach, such as holding presentations at conferences like the one today, to identify potentially impacted users and communicate expected changes. Next slide. So if IGLD already exists, why do we need a new one? Well, there's two primary reasons for updating the existing datum. The first is glacial isostatic adjustment, which we call GIA. And this is the ongoing rebounding of land caused by the retreat of glaciers that covered the region during the last ice age, so about 12,000 years ago. The second reason is the existence of systematic leveling errors present in the existing IGLD dating from 1985. Leveling was traditionally used across the system, and there's a known 35 centimeter leveling error in IGLD 1985. So IGLD 2020 will utilize newer, more advanced surveying technology to modernize the existing datum. Next slide. As indicated, glacial isostatic adjustment is the ongoing rebounding of land caused by the retreat of glaciers. It's the primary reason for updating the IGLD. Well, as IGLD takes place over time, it results in the tilting of the region, which causes water levels to change relative to the rising or subsiding, so sinking shorelines. GIA tilting is not uniform across the Great Lakes region. The north is experiencing uplift and the south is experiencing subsidence. This averages out to about 7 millimeters a year, or 21 centimeters over a 30-year period. We are currently overdue to update the IGLD to account for GIA in the region. Next slide. So this graph here shows the effects of GIA on the region's water levels over time. Each line shown reflects the water level differences at gauges in Lake Superior with respect to a master station in Marquette. We see that as years go by, GIA causes water levels to appear to fall in the north as the land rises and rise in the south as the land subsides. This will result in less water in northern harbors than in southern harbors, and the magnitude of change that is expected will depend on the location of a station. Next slide. So IGLD needs to be updated every 25 to 30 years to account for those land shifts, so GIA. Previous iterations of the IGLD date from 1955, which was the first IGLD, and IGLD 1985, which is the current IGLD. The upcoming or new IGLD will be known as IGLD 2020 and is based on the new North American Pacific Geopotential Datum of 2022. You know, that's a mouthful. You can also call it NAPGD 2022. NAPGD 2022 is expected to be adopted sometime after the year 2025. IGLD 2020 will also be compatible with the existing Canadian vertical datum of 2013, which is already in use across Canada. In contrast to previous iterations of IGLD, the new IGLD 2020 will be geoid-based and utilize advanced surveying technology. Next slide. So there are 4 main attributes that define or make up the IGLD. This slide here will cover the first 2, and then I'll go on to the next 2 in the next slide. So the first attribute is a reference zero. This is the reference datum for heights. It's usually set at mean sea level. Throughout the history of IGLD, there have been different realizations of the reference zero. IGLD 1955 used mean sea level at Pointe-au-Père, Quebec for its reference zero, while IGLD 1985 used mean sea level there, as well as at Rimouski for its reference zero. That's about 5 kilometers downstream. IGLD 2020 has adopted the same reference zero as the new NAPGD 2022, so the North American Pacific Geopotential Datum, which was mentioned on the previous slide. This same value is also adopted by the Canadian vertical datum of 2013. The IGLD 2020 reference zero will be 31 centimeters above that of IGLD 1985. The second attribute is the reference surface, which is the equal potential surface to which mean sea level heights are referenced. The reference surface basically extends the reference zero inland. In IGLD 1955 and 85, the surface was defined by geodetic leveling, which is time consuming and cost prohibitive. It's also accessible only where leveling exists and susceptible to the accumulation of systematic errors. So in IGLD 2020, the reference surface will be defined by this newer, more accurate NAPGD 2022 geoid. Next slide. The third attribute of IGLD 2020 is dynamic heights. Dynamic heights are constant along a geopotential surface, such as a lake, and provide a direct determination for hydraulic head. They're required for water management and power generation. And then the fourth and final attribute defining IGLD 2020 is the reference epoch. This is a point in time to which data is referenced. For IGLD 2020, the reference epoch spans 7 years from 2017 to 2023. The central point of this epoch is 2020, hence why the forthcoming IGLD is named IGLD 2020. Water level heights will need to be referenced to the 2020 epoch to account for GIA in the region. Next slide. So now I'll go into a bit about the scope of the update. So an updated IGLD means that Canadian and US partners will need to collect GNSS and water level data at over 200 stations across the region. A major binational GNSS survey campaign of all of these stations, which was originally planned for 2022, has been postponed to, it was originally planned for 2020, it has been postponed to 2022. Each country will operate and maintain its own respective network of permanent and seasonal water level stations. In Canada, IGLD gauges are operated by the Canadian Hydrographic Service, so CHS, and in the US, these IGLD gauges are operated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so NOAA. In addition to these gauges, there are several other network gauges, so the Seaway Corporations, US Army Corps of Engineers, USGS, Environment and Climate Change Canada, New York Power Authority, and Ontario Power Generation also operate their own gauges. Next slide. So we're using, for the IGLD 2020 update, we're using permanent and seasonal gauges. So permanent stations are usually located in brick or metal structures, and they're built on solid foundations where year-round water level measurements are critical for operations. These stations are equipped with redundant sensors to ensure data collection continues if a sensor fails. Heat lamps are situated inside of these stations to help prevent the water from freezing in the cold winter months. Other sensors present at permanent stations may include data loggers, meteorological and oceanographic sensors, high accuracy GNSS, and communications. Water level data from these stations is transmitted every 6 minutes in the US and 3 minutes in Canada. There are currently 58 permanent gauges in Canada and 53 in the US. GNSS has been installed at 13 of these stations in Canada and 17 in the US. The seasonal gauging is used to determine lake topography and fill in critical data gaps. They help to densify the network of permanent gauges in both the US and Canada. For IGLD 2020, seasonal gauging considered 140 potential locations. Several factors, including lake surface topography, proximity to benchmark locations, and the existence of ports or coastal infrastructure, were considered for the selection of seasonal gauge locations. In the end, Canada chose 66 locations and the US chose 54 locations for its seasonal gauge sites. Each seasonal gauge is installed, has been installed, or will be installed for a single summer during the IGLD update period. Next slide. So we're not going to go through this whole slide. I just wanted to show you how large scale the effort is. We've identified, the Vertical Control Water Level Subcommittee has identified a timeline of milestones that need to be met for the IGLD 2020 update. So I just wanted to quickly show you that timeline here to give you an understanding of the scope. We'll go in a bit more into the main activities on the next slide. Next slide. So as it stands, the subcommittee is in the middle of the IGLD 2020 update. A plan outlining the update is available on the coordinating committee's website if you'd like to read it. It's publicly accessible. I'll provide the website link to that site at the end of this presentation. We are slightly past halfway in the data collection period for IGLD 2020. As mentioned, this data collection period spans that 7-year reference epoch from 2017 to 2023. During this period, we are installing seasonal gauging and conducting a GNSS survey campaign to collect global navigation satellite positioning data at over 200 locations. These activities ensure binational consistency and linking of observations. So future IGLD 2020 updates activities are listed here as planned. They include the determination of lake topography as well as low water datum, the creation of crustal movement models using GNSS data collected, the publication of transformations between IGLD 2020 and other datums, and the validation of IGLD 2020 heights and the crustal movement model. Next slide. In addition to NOAA and CHS gauges, I mentioned that there are many other entity gauge stations used for water management operations in the Great Lakes. These range from federal gauges, such as the ones maintained by USGS and ECCC, to non-federal gauges, such as the ones maintained by municipalities or power entities. Entity gauging is used for a range of operations, from dredging and lock operations to navigation and water outflow regulation. All of these gauges will need to be updated to IGLD 2020. Many of these gauges, fortunately, will be included in the 2022 GNSS survey campaign. Next slide. As part of the ongoing update, we will also need to determine and publish transformations between IGLD 2020 and older datums. This is needed because many products currently use older datums. These will have to be updated to the new datum, and it's not possible to regenerate all of these products in the new IGLD. So transformation models and tools will be built to convert those older datums to IGLD 2020. This may require the digitization of heights in older datums, and the tools will need to be capable of transforming thousands of data points. The accuracy of transformations will rely on the number of stations included in our GNSS survey campaign, as well as the spatial coverage of stations common with older datums. The transformations will allow any products that currently reference older datums to update more easily and automatically. Next slide. So updating water levels to a new IGLD will have an impact on many operations, products, and services in the region, including the economic viability and safety of commercial and recreational navigation, including the generation of nautical charts and dredging in ports, harbors, and channels, as well as water level regulations such as hydropower planning and forecasting, coastal zone management and planning, including flood and erosion prediction and response, as well as coastal structure design, construction, and maintenance. It will also impact coastal habitat restoration under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which may include ecosystem restoration and management. Next slide. So the US and Canadian federal agencies supporting the coordinating committee with the IGLD 2020 update will need to identify potentially impacted stakeholders and product users to educate them on and prepare them for the forthcoming update and outcomes. To achieve this goal, there's an outreach working group that has been convened to develop a detailed communications and outreach plan. This plan is now being used to guide current and planned outreach for the update. It has defined a process to identify and communicate with stakeholders. It also defines which communication channels should be used to engage stakeholders and what outreach products such as fact sheets or infographics or webinars would be the most impactful. We've built in outreach tracking and evaluation metrics that will be used to measure previously conducted outreach and adjust future outreach to ensure a robust and successful program. Next slide. Using the outreach plan as our guide, the working group has now begun to implement some of the activities. So over the course of the past year and a half, we've coordinated the development of news articles with regional port authorities, municipal newspapers, and digital publishers. I've listed some examples here. I've shown some here on the screen. We have also been interviewed by a public radio station for a podcast episode and conducted outreach with several federal agencies to hold webinars and generate newsletter contributions, such as the one for the Surveying Community of Practice. We've also worked with the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory to write social media posts for their Facebook. The outreach working group consists of 22 members from 6 Canadian and US federal agencies, and we now meet on a monthly basis to discuss priorities and plan next steps. We will continue to work with external writers to develop newspapers and newspaper articles and journal contributions, present at conferences, generate digital outreach visuals such as infographics, blog entries, and fact sheets. We're planning to present IGLD at board meetings such as the Spring 2022 IJC Commissioners Meeting. We're going to continue to also organize targeted webinars. We found that webinars are really well received. So if you are someone or someone that you know would be interested in a targeted webinar about the IGLD update, please reach out to me or the subcommittee leads, and we are happy to work with you to develop a webinar for your audiences. My email address is nicole.kruz@noaa.gov. Next slide. So if you want more information about the IGLD 2020 update, you can visit our binational website at www.greatlakescc.org. Just a quick note that our website is going to be moving to a new platform, so the look and feel of the site will probably change over the next couple of months, so just don't be surprised by that. If you want to get in touch with us, I've provided the names and email addresses of our Canadian and US subcommittee leads here, which are Therese Herron for Canada and Laura Rear-McLaughlin for the US. And then if you want to talk to me about communications or outreach, you can email me as well. Any technical or all other questions should go to Laura and Therese. Next slide. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I'd like to open the floor to any questions. Please add your questions in the comment box.
Again, thank you, Nicole. That was great. I think we just had one question, kind of starts out as a statement, but we're surprised to see that the impacts of the glacier that retreat is still, sort of impacts the level of water on the Great Lakes. Do you see that that basically impacts from climate change and the retreating ice sheet is potentially having an impact on the datum levels?
So I guess we don't really touch on climate change. I mean, glacial isostatic adjustment isn't really related to climate change. It's a long ongoing process that is just continuing, has been continuing for thousands of years. So I would say no, that's not a factor.